Welcome back to American Literature 1, folks. Today we are discussing the work of Ralph Ellison and his story Battle Royale. Before we get into that, let's talk a little bit about Mr. Ellison's background. Ralph Ellison went to school to study to be a musician at Tuskegee College, then Tuskegee College, now Tuskegee University, a renowned HBCU, that is, historically black college university. Once he got there, reading of T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland set him off on a literary path instead. He moved to New York to raise money for school over the summer, but never came back, largely due to the Depression. And he also became a very important part of the Harlem Renaissance. In Harlem, he met Langston Hughes, the poet, and Richard Wright, the author of the novel Black Boy, and he began writing stories and reviews. This story that we're reading today, Battle Royale, comes from his novel Invisible Man, often finds itself on the banned books list because of its controversial material. This was the only novel he had, the only novel he released while he was alive. He worked on a second for the next 40 years of his life, but he was so obsessed with making it perfect, he never completed it. That novel was called Juneteenth and was released in 1994, shortly after his death. So what's at work here? Well, there's conflict. Okay, conflict. We basically have man versus society, but there are other conflicts at work too here in this story. We have quite obviously man versus man because it's a fight, and to a greater or lesser degree, man versus himself because there are throughout the story the narrator is struggling with his own thoughts, his own goals, what he wants here. This was written way before the Civil Rights Movement. The story came out in 1952. And let's take a look at some of the events here. Now, it's told in flashback. We have a first-person narrator, and first-person narrators are often unreliable, typically unreliable. Not that they're lying necessarily, but we have only the first-person narrator's perspective on the story to guide us. And this is as opposed to an omniscient narrator who knows all, tells all. Eyewitness testimony, for example, often seen as unreliable because, we view things, our memory is faulty. We view things with our own biases and our own baggage here. Themes in the story, there is racial inequality, quite obviously. There is the wearing of masks, the naivety of youth, too, because our narrator still thinks he's going to be getting a fair shake from these folks, that he's going to be treated respectfully and properly by predominantly white society. And this is clearly not the case. Masks. Let's talk about masks. Here in the first passage here, we have the grandfather who identifies himself as a traitor. Let me just pull this over here onto the screen here. Let's take a look at the text itself. But my grandfather is the one. He was an odd old guy. My grandfather, and I am told I take after him. It was he who caused the trouble. On his deathbed, he called my father and said, "Son, after I'm gone, I want you to keep up the good fight. I never told you, but our life is a war, and I have been a traitor all my born days, a spy in the enemy's country, ever since I gave up my gun back in Reconstruction. Live with your head in the lion's mouth. I want you to overcome them with yeses, undermine them with grins, agree them to death and destruction. Let them let them swallow you, rather, till they vomit and bust wide open." They thought the old man had gone out of his mind, that he'd been the meekest of men. He had been the meekest of men. The younger children were rushed from the room, and the shades drawn, and the flame of the lamp turned low, so that it sputtered on the wick, like the old man's breathing. "Learn it to the young'uns," he whispered fiercely, and then he died. Okay, so when I say mask, what do I mean by that? Well, the grandfather here wears a mask, right? He is, he's saying, look, all my life, our life is a war. Our life to exist in this white society and try to get a fair shake, try to get an equal share of this country. It's depends on going masked, right? We have to overcome them with kindness, act like we are pleasant and polite and decent, and kind of what our narrator does here at the after his speech. And he thinks, he still thinks he's going to get a fair shake moving in. He thinks he's going to be treated with respect and get to make his speech, and that is all he's concerned with, never quite seeing what his grandfather was trying to tell him, at least not in this part of the novel. Yeah. Second example, the American Dream. That is the dancer that is brought into to the gathering of these rich and wealthy individuals, these big shots from the town, fire chiefs and doctors and lawyers, and even one very fashionable pastor. She wears a mask. She's wearing makeup and a fixed smile. She is as much of a victim as the narrator here. He's conflicted. He's sexually aroused, but at once he feels the need to protect her as well. And now this novel came out about 1952. This was 3 years before Emmett Till was murdered by a group of white men for allegedly whistling at a white woman, which it turns out was not true. Her story was coerced because they just wanted to kill someone and make an example of someone who was an African American man, young man, for the community. Yeah. And if this story bothers you, once again, your moral compass is pointed in the right direction. This is an extremely bothersome story. The story is actually based on a folk tale about plantation owners bringing their white slaves in, bringing their slaves to fight for the entertainment of the white men. Apologies there. What is the significance? We refer to her as American Dream. She's this nude dancer with this sort of tattoo of the American flag just above her, below her navel, right? And what is the significance of this? Well, she is the one she's the one that they can't touch, right? 1952. What would happen if they looked at? They weren't even supposed to look at her. Although some of the white men were yelling for them to look at her. Some were saying, "Don't you look at her." The significance here is if they looked too long, if they touched, there would be terrible violence done to them. Right? They would have been lynched. She's brought in here to tempt these young African American males and the white men themselves too. But they were brought in. She was brought in to kind of embarrass them and shame them and tantalize them, get them aroused for the fight. But as representative of the American dream, it's something that they cannot achieve, something that they cannot touch, something that they cannot grasp. The white men, on the other hand, of course, not only they lay hold of her, not only they get to look at her, but they abuse her as well. In the dream, the grandfather, the dream that comes at the end of the story, the grandfather refuses to laugh at the clowns at the circus. That is because he sees the narrator as a victim. He's a performer playing for the white men, and he recognizes that. Yeah. The endless envelopes are meant to keep the narrator busy so he won't become a threat. He opens the briefcase at the end, starts opening envelope after envelope after envelope. And that is representative of pretty much what African Americans were told after Reconstruction, perhaps even into this day. Wait a little longer. Here, do this. Wait a little longer. Okay, jump through this hoop. You'll get what you're promised, what you deserve. In the fight, big symbol here is the white blindfold. Typically, blindfolds are black. They're not white. The white men have blinded these young men as to who their enemy is, who it really is. They're pitting them against one another for the pleasure of these rich white folks. What does the invisible man do? He pushes it up so he can see. He cheats a little bit. He's exceptional. He is extremely intelligent and well-spoken, and there's potential to be a scholar, and so he sees himself as a little bit better than the rest of the guys. He says so himself. He says, I didn't really care for these fellas. They didn't really care for me either. American Dream, of course, is a symbol herself. She is, and the white men can touch her and grope her and grab her, whereas the black men are not allowed to. Now, most of this takes place in a boxing ring, right? The fight, the battle royale itself, the ring is also kind of symbolic. They have to fight and scrounge, and at the end they scrounge for coins that are left on the carpet, which is electrified. This is also part of the perverse entertainment of these extremely rich and wealthy fellas. Every time they get close to something, the rich white men take it away. And only to find out that, you know, it's false. It's just brass. It's not gold coins. They're just some cheap brass tokens. The struggle here. There's struggle and hope, but it's false hope. The narrator keeps believing that he'll get a fair shake. He keeps thinking that he's going to show off his talent to these white men. Will never let him be a part of them. In the ring, it finally comes down to our narrator and the biggest, toughest of the other young men, a guy named Tatlock. Tatlock, who is has arranged with the other fighters to be the last one in the ring. Right, all the other guys, they make a good show and then they take a dive, and then it's just Tatlock and our unnamed narrator. Tatlock is the champ versus the invisible man here. And notice too, our narrator has no name. Right, that's significant. You'll see this again repeated again later in a later novel by an modern author named Colson Whitehead. It's a story called Apex Hides the Herd, and our narrator has no name. Right, because in society, and especially in white society, like we see here on the screen here, to these guys, he doesn't have a name. He has an epithet he is referred to. He has a color he's referred to by, but he has not given a name. Narrator tries to con Tatlock into letting him win. He tells him, look, I just want to look good for these white guys. He goes, I'll even give you the prize money. Just take a dive. Right? He's thinking, all right, if I can look good for these guys, they'll accept me, and I get to make my speech, and I get to move on. No. Tatlock, though, he's not into it. He won't buy it. Won't do it. He says, every time the narrator suggests something to him, Tatlock rebuffs him. He says, I'll give you the money. Keep the money. Give it to your mother. Well, I'll give you $5. He says, I'll break your behind. Who do we pull for here? Who is being more honest? Who is more true to himself? I have to go with Tatlock on this one. Tatlock has come to accept the fact that this is how he must work within the system. His word and his world and station are terrible, but at least he's honest about it, and honest about who he is. He doesn't really buy into it. He's there. He works within the confines of the society here. Yeah. So in the end, they give him a briefcase. They give him. He gets to make his speech to the white men. He gets to stand out there and talk to them, but they don't really appreciate him, do they? No, of course not. They're part of their entertainment. They're making fun of him still, even though he doesn't see it. You think after the exhibition fight and getting his clock cleaned by Tatlock and the really cruel incident of pitching coins for them to run after and then electrifying the rug, that he might catch on. And he doesn't. Yeah. And so he gets there and he starts making a speech, and he's having to swallow blood because to keep from spilling out as he's trying to talk or choke on it. And he makes a mistake of saying, instead of social responsibility, he says social equality. See, this is scary. This sets the men off. Why are they upset about this? They're upset because they don't want African Americans to be equal. Right? It's a threat. It's a threat to them and their power structure. It is a threat to their society. if we allow them, their thinking is if we allow them to be equal, eventually they could rise above us. Yeah. So the idea of equality angers them, upsets them. And one of them says kind of gently, "You didn't mean to be smart, did you?" Right? Sympathetically, but still saying, you know to stay in your place, right? That's what you meant to do. And our narrator says, "Oh yes, I was just swallowing blood, responsibility." Yeah. So at the conclusion of the show, they give him his prize. It's a briefcase and a letter admitting him to an HBCU. Yeah, recommendation. And the president of the school board, or the school superintendent, was there, the one who suggested it to him, and said that you should really give the speech to this group of white big shots that you made at graduation. He's there, and he's part of the entire system here of oppression. And our narrator just doesn't see it, at least not overtly. But then we have the dream, right? He's dreaming, he's at home that night, and he's in his bed, and he's thinking about the day that was. And he dreams that he and his grandfather are at the circus, and his grandfather refuses to laugh at the clowns. Because he knows the fix is in. See, what's happening is psychologically, the narrator's putting it together. It's coming to him. And his grandfather says, "Why don't you open that briefcase and look at that letter and see what it said?" So there's envelope after envelope after envelope. And finally inside, there's just a handwritten letter engraved. It says, "Make this," I'll repeat the racial slur, "make him run." Yeah. It's just a dream, but it's a dream that tells the truth, right? It's a dream that reflects a reality that he is finally coming to grips with, although not necessarily at this point. Yeah. Disturbing story. Brilliantly written. Painful to read, but kind of sums up quite accurately the kind of world that Ralph Ellison knew. This is years before the Civil Rights Movement. So there it is, the Battle Royal from Ralph Ellison from the novel Invisible Man. All right, so I thank you for your time and attention, and I'll see you in the next video.